The city of Oakhaven, drowning in mist, drowning in prayers soaked in blood. In the heart of the court of justice, Judge Thorne lies dead, slumped over a pristine white writ. Time is running out. The darkness is swallowing the last of the candles. Julian Vane sees them, words carved in fresh blood, shimmering under the sacred flame. A name has returned, a traitor executed by Parliament 10 years ago. Back from the grave, a nightmare is crawling out from the cracks of the law. The priest stands in the shadows. His hands grip a seal of power. It is cold and filled with malice. The chapel bells toll, a countdown to the end of justice. Whatever you do, do not turn around. The ghost of the past is here. He is reclaiming a debt that should have been erased forever. Oakhaven had not seen the sun in 11 years. The city's residents had grown accustomed to this, not by healing the ache, but by redistributing weight, by learning which movements to avoid, by constructing entire lives around the negative space of something missing. The fog had come the winter after Valerius was hanged, or so the old ones said, as though the sky itself had drawn a curtain over something it could not bear to witness twice. Merchants lit their lanterns at midday. Children born in the last decade had never seen their own shadows fall long and golden across warm cobblestones. The fog was simply the sky, as far as they knew. It had always been this way. It would always be this way. The Parliament building stood at Oakhaven Center. Like a bad tooth, the city's mouth had grown around. Massive, asymmetrical, its towers accumulating additions across 3 centuries of self-important governance, until the whole structure resembled nothing so much as a man who had added rooms to his house, rather than ever cleaning the original ones. Its windows glowed amber at all hours, from certain angles, in certain alleys, on certain mystic nights. It looked almost warm. The fair court occupied a humbler address. 3 stories, gray limestone, clean-angled, unostentatious. Julian Vane had worked there for 6 years. He was 24 years old, and he believed, with the particular confidence of a young man who has read extensively and suffered insufficiently, that the law was a thing that functioned. He believed this on the morning he found Judge Thorne dead in the reading room with a blank sheet of vellum beside his outstretched hand. The body was not yet cold. Julian stood in the doorway for a long moment, his satchel hanging from his shoulder, his morning dispatch still rolled and sealed under one arm. The reading room smelled of old bindings and the particular tallow of court-issue candles, and beneath those smells, faintly, the copper salt scent of blood that had left a body by means other than a wound. Judge Thorne was slumped in his reading chair, his left hand resting open on the armrest, his right hand extended toward the writing table as though reaching for something. His eyes were closed. He looked less like a dead man and more like a man who had fallen asleep mid-reach. On the table, beneath the outstretched hand, was a single sheet of vellum, blank, as far as Julian could see. No ink, no seal, no marks of any kind. Julian set down his satchel. He crossed the room, moving carefully around the judge's feet, and picked up the vellum. It was heavier than blank paper should be, not in weight exactly, but in the way a letter feels heavier when it contains news that will change something. He turned it over. Both sides were empty. He was about to set it down when he noticed that his hands were warm from the morning walk, and that the vellum pressed between his fingers, was warming with them. He held it closer to the candle. The letters came up slowly, as heat coaxed them from wherever they had been hiding. Not ink that had dried transparent, but something darker, something that had soaked into the vellum, rather than sitting on its surface. Something that had been written with a substance that dried the color of old skin, and revealed itself only under heat as the color it truly was. Red, dark red, the color of blood that has already clotted. The name written on the vellum, in a hand that Julian recognized as Judge Thorne's judicial script, was a single word: Valerius. Beneath the name, in smaller letters, he lives, he witnesses, he must be brought forth. Julian set the vellum down very carefully on the table. He looked at it for a moment. He picked it up again and folded it twice and placed it inside his coat, next to his chest, where the warmth of his body would not reveal it if anyone else came looking. Then he went to find a physician to report the judge's death, moving at the unhurried pace of a man who has not just discovered anything of significance whatsoever. He had been a court clerk long enough to know that a piece of paper only becomes dangerous at the moment someone else learns you have it. Senator Hayes was waiting outside the building when Julian emerged. This was not, by itself, remarkable. Senator Hayes was the sort of man who was very frequently outside buildings, waiting, in the way that a bird of prey is frequently circling. He was tall and spare, with gray hair cut close to his skull, and the kind of face that had started its life as handsome and had been slowly colonized, over decades of ambition, into something that resembled handsomeness. The way a portrait resembles a person, technically correct, somehow wrong. He was accompanied by 4 parliamentary wardens, which was 2 more than the law required, and 4 more than Julian would have liked. Clerk Vane, Hayes said, with the particular warmth of a man for whom warmth is a tool. A tragedy about Judge Thorne. I came as soon as I heard. Senator. Julian inclined his head with the correct degree of deference. Enough to be respectful. Not enough to suggest nervousness. I was about to send word to the court administrator. Of course. And the judge's personal papers? His effects in the reading room. The room is sealed pending the court administrator's inventory, Julian said. Protocol. Hayes's expression did not change. It was one of his more impressive qualities, the absolute stillness of a face that had learned to make decisions before displaying them. There may have been a writ in preparation, Hayes said. A parliamentary matter. It would be most efficient if I simply... Any writ issued from this court falls under the jurisdiction of the court administrator, Julian said, until properly registered. He paused. Also protocol. The silence that followed was the kind that Julian could feel against his skin. Of course, Hayes said. Finally. Process it, then. He turned and walked away. The 4 wardens followed. Julian watched them go with the expression of a man watching weather. Then he turned and walked in the opposite direction, at a pace that was not quite running, toward the darker part of the city, where the streets were older and the alleys had more exits. Elias had been blind for 30 years and served as the Fair Court's archivist for 25 of them. He was seated at his cataloging desk when Julian arrived, running his fingertips along the spines of a row of ledgers, with the automatic confidence of a man for whom the landscape of knowledge had been entirely transferred to touch. You smell like the street, Elias said. You've been running. What have you broken? I haven't broken anything, Julian said. "I've found something." He described what was on the vellum. Elias listened without moving, which was how he listened when something required his complete attention, rather than merely his patience. "Valerius," Elias said, when Julian finished. "You know who he is. Everyone who was in this city 11 years ago knows who he was supposed to be," Elias said. "A traitor to the Parliament, a forger of public records, a man who was tried and hanged in the public square on the 20th of March, 11 years ago, in front of 300 witnesses, by order of the tribunal." He paused. "I was one of the witnesses. He was brought out in chains. The sentence was read. The hood was placed. And then..." He stopped. "And then," Julian said. "And then I lost him," Elias said quietly. "In the crowd. The fog that day was exceptional. People surged forward. By the time the square settled, the proceedings were declared complete, and the body had been taken for processing, as they called it. I thought I had simply missed the moment." He turned his face toward the lamp, though he couldn't see it. "Lost it in the crowd." "But you didn't," Julian said. "No," Elias said. "I don't think I did." He reached under his desk and produced a key on a cord, iron, old, with a head shaped like a doubled fist. "The subarchive," he said. "Third level down. There are records from the tribunal that were sealed after Valerius's verdict. I always found it strange that records of a completed case required sealing." He paused. "They may tell you where to look. Go quickly. The parliamentary clerks visit every fortnight, and their last visit was 13 days ago." Julian took the key. "Elias," he said, "my father, Judge Aldrich Vane, he sat on the tribunal. Did you know?" The old archivist was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "Go, Julian. Quickly." The subarchive was 3 levels below the main reading room. Julian went down with a lantern. Inside a sealed wooden chest that bore 2 different locks were 27 documents. Julian read them by lamplight, sitting on the cold stone floor of the subarchive. And by the time he reached the 17th, he understood that his father had signed his name to every one of them. The documents were, collectively, the secret history of Valerius's verdict, private correspondence between Tribunal Judge Aldrich Vane, Senator Hayes, and High Priest Anselm, written across the 8 months before the trial. The negotiation, the careful construction of charges, the decision about which witnesses to call and which to lose track of. They were the working papers of a verdict that had been written before the evidence was gathered. Valerius had possessed, before his arrest, a complete list of parliamentary debt holders, names, amounts, and the manner in which those debts had been incurred. He had also possessed the original Charter of Fairness, not a copy, the founding document itself. He had been arrested before he could produce either. The 17th document was a letter from Judge Aldrich Vane to Senator Hayes, dated 2 days before the verdict was to be read. "I have signed the writ as agreed. The man will not be executed. This I have required as the condition of my cooperation, and I hold you to it. He will be kept living as insurance against your own future ambitions. For I am not so foolish as to trust that your word, once he is dead, is worth anything. This peace we have built is fragile. It requires its ghosts to remain." Julian read it 3 times, then a 4th time, to be certain he had understood it correctly. His father had not. In the end, been entirely monstrous. He had been something worse than monstrous. He had been cowardly, in a precise and calculating way. Cowardly enough to build his cowardice into the terms of a transaction. Cowardly enough to believe that negotiating the method of a man's destruction made him something other than the man's destroyer. He had kept Valerius alive, somewhere, under someone's power, for 11 years. Where would they keep him? Julian said. Alive, hidden. 11 years. Elias was quiet for a long moment. There is a place beneath the cathedral of the undying word, he said finally. That does not appear on any civic map. I know this because I was given the civic maps to catalog, and they were complete in every other respect. He paused. Go carefully. Anselm is very protective of his basement. The Cathedral of the Undying Word occupied the hill above Oakhaven's eastern quarter, with the particular arrogance of institutions that have existed long enough to mistake age for righteousness. It was a beautiful building, in the way that beautiful things sometimes serve as the faces of ugly ones. All soaring arches and pale stone that caught the fog's diffuse light and scattered it into something that, from a distance, resembled the glow of genuine holiness. Close. The stone was cold, and the arches were very good at bouncing footsteps, until they sounded like many people, even when you were alone. Julian arrived in a borrowed clergyman's robe. He had 3 things in his coat: the blood writ with Valerius's name, a letter bearing Judge Thorne's seal, and a story that he had spent the walk across the city constructing. He was admitted to Anselm's private receiving room within the quarter hour. High Priest Anselm was a small man who had spent his life learning to appear large. He sat in a chair that was technically not a throne, in the same way that a parliamentary building is technically not a palace. The distinction was legal, not visual. His face had the quality of very old marble, smooth, cool, slightly inhuman, and capable of crushing things. Clerk Vane, he said. He had, Julian noted, not needed to be told the name. You carry a document requiring my seal. Julian placed the vellum on the table between them. He watched Anselm read it. He watched the moment when Anselm read the name. The high priest's face did not move. It was an impressive performance. Julian gave him credit for it. This name, Anselm said, refers to a man who was executed 11 years ago. The writ refers to whoever bears this name in the record of the court, Julian said. If that person is deceased, authentication simply confirms the writ is void. He paused. It is a simple procedural matter. The seal costs nothing if the man is dead. Another silence. Julian was beginning to develop an appreciation for the silences of powerful men. Each one had its own texture, its own particular weight. Anselm reached for the seal. Julian thought, there it is, the thing that gives him away. He could have refused, but he sealed it, because unsealed could be challenged. Sealed, it exists officially, and official existence, even of a document he intends to destroy, is harder for him than he'd like to admit. He sealed it. He pressed it hard into the wax. He handed it back to Julian. The fair court thanks the church for its cooperation, Julian said, with the precise degree of humility that is indistinguishable from contempt. He was in the corridor when the first warden rounded the corner, at a pace that indicated orders had just been given. He was in the street when the cathedral bells began to ring. He was running when the parliamentary wardens appeared at the far end of the street. They cornered him at the river gate. in the alley between the tannery and the ferryman's dock, where the cobblestones were permanently damp, and the fog off the water was thick enough to reduce everything to silhouettes. There were 6 parliamentary wardens, and Senator Hayes, who had evidently decided that if you wanted something done correctly, you appeared yourself. He stood in front of his wardens with his hands clasped behind his back, and his face arranged in something that was not quite patience and not quite anger, but sat exactly between them, where decisions live. "Give me the writ, Clerk Vane," he said, "and we will discuss what you think you know." The quality of Hayes's silence changed. "Your father," Hayes said, finally, and his voice had changed, had gone from the warm tool voice to something flatter, more honest, which Julian found more frightening. He was a man who understood the cost of order. He made difficult choices so that this city could continue to function. "Do you understand what order costs?" "He signed a death warrant for an innocent man," Julian said. "He signed a containment order for a dangerous one. The charges were constructed in correspondence between you, Anselm, and my father, across 8 months before the trial. I have read the originals." Silence. "You are his son," Hayes said. "This will destroy his name, everything he built, everything he left you. The Vane family has served this city for 4 generations. You would burn that for a man you've never met." Julian thought about his father, about a man he had admired completely, in the unexamined way you admire a father when you are young enough to believe that admiration is the same as understanding. He thought about a man who had believed in the law and had still done what he had done, and had called it maintenance. "He built it wrong," Julian said. "I would rather have no name than a name built on a buried man." He turned and ran, which was not the elegant ending the moment deserved. But the wardens were moving, and elegance was not currently among his available options. He ran toward the river, and jumped, and was very cold for a very long time, and pulled himself out on the far bank in the fog, and sat in the mud, and thought about what it meant to be your father's son, in a city your father had helped to ruin. Then he got up, because there was still work to do. Raven Hill had been named for the birds that roost in the old oak at its summit, which were not ravens, but jackdaws. The hill overlooked the city from the west, and the great house that occupied its crest overlooked the hill, and the widow Seraphina overlooked everything, from the great house's upper gallery, with the air of a woman who has had 11 years to perfect the precise angle of her observation. She wore no jewelry except a ring on her right hand that she turned with her thumb when she was thinking, which was more or less constantly. "You're Aldrich Vane's son," she said when he was brought in. "Yes," Julian said. He had stopped being surprised by how many people knew who his father was. "You've read the tribunal papers?" "Yes." "Then you know what your father kept alive, and why, and where." She looked at him steadily. "And you've come to me because you know I've been keeping track of where." She had been Valerius's ally before his arrest. Their plan had been simple: produce both sets of documents before the full parliament, invoke Article 1 of the Charter, and let the Charter itself adjudicate what the Parliament and Church had done to it. They had been 3 days from filing when Valerius was arrested. She had spent 11 years completing the case they had started. "The debt ledgers are here," she said. "Every member of the Parliament who borrowed against public funds, who took payments for judgments, who sold civic appointments." She paused. including the members who were paid to lose track of Valerius during the execution and transfer him to the cathedral's care. That transaction is documented in particular detail. And Valerius? Julian said. Where exactly? The crypt level of the Cathedral of the Undying Word, she said. There is a passage behind the sacristy that leads to cells used 300 years ago for monks who had committed serious offenses against the community. The passage does not appear on the cathedral's official records. He's been in the third cell. I have had contact through an intermediary approximately once a year. She paused. He is alive. He is not well, but alive. The passage behind the sacristy was exactly where the old map said it would be, which Julian found both reassuring and depressing. Reassuring because it meant the map was good. Depressing because it meant that for 11 years, a man had been 3 feet behind a wall that nobody officially knew existed, and nobody had bothered to check. He went in alone, with a lantern borrowed from the cathedral's own supply, which felt appropriate. The cells were stone, hewn rather than built, dating to the cathedral's original construction, when the concept of imprisonment had been less sophisticated and more direct. 300 years had given them a particular smell, stone damp and old straw, and the cold that exists in places where sunlight never reaches, where temperature becomes a permanent condition rather than a variable one. The third cell had a lock that had been changed. Julian worked at it for 4 minutes. That felt considerably longer. The door opened inward. The man inside was not what Julian had expected. Valerius had been, by all accounts, imposing, broad, authoritative, the kind of physical presence that made rooms smaller. He was still tall, but the width was gone, worn off by years of insufficient food and no sunlight, and the kind of muscle loss that happens when there is nothing to use muscles for. His hair and beard were white and long. His eyes, when Julian's lantern light hit them, were extraordinary, dark and completely alert. The eyes of a man whose body had surrendered almost everything, but whose mind had spent 11 years with nothing to do but sharpen itself. You're not one of Anselm's people, Valerius said. His voice was rough from disuse, but its structure was still there. The structure of a man who had been trained to speak, in rooms full of people who needed to be convinced of things. No, Julian said. I'm the son of the judge who signed your writ. A long silence. He's dead, Valerius said. 4 years ago, natural causes. And you are here because Thorne wrote your name in blood before he died, and because I've read the tribunal papers, and because Serafina has been waiting 11 years, and I think we've made her wait long enough. Julian held out his hand. We need to move. Valerius looked at the hand. He looked at the lantern. He looked at the door that was standing open, which was something he had probably thought about every day for 11 years. He took the hand. Julian pulled. They moved through the passage, both of them moving as quietly as possible, which was easier than Julian had expected, because Valerius moved like a man who had learned to move carefully when anything else had consequences. They were 20 feet from the sacristy door when they heard voices. Julian killed the lantern. The darkness was total. How many? Valerius said, almost without sound. 2, Julian said. Maybe 3. Wait. They waited. The voices passed. Julian counted to 60 and relit the lantern. They came out through the cathedral's coal delivery entrance. Past midnight, the fog had thickened until the lantern created only a small sphere of visibility, which was, under the circumstances, an asset. They rode to the fair court. The court administrator, Magistrate Fenwick, answered his private door in a nightrobe, looked at Julian, looked at Valerius, looked at the seal on the writ, and said nothing for a very long time. Article 1, Julian said. I know what it says, Fenwick said. He looked at Valerius again. Is this really him? Yes, Valerius said. I am. 11 years, Fenwick said, to no one in particular. He went inside and came back with a key on a heavy chain. What happens after you open the case, Vane? We read the charter aloud, Julian said, in the public square, at dawn, before anyone who was willing to stand and listen. The vault of the fair court was cut from bedrock and lined in lead to protect its contents from the moisture that pervaded Oakhaven's foundations. The door was iron, 2 inches thick, with a mechanism that required both keys simultaneously, in locks positioned 18 inches apart, a design that made single-person operation physically impossible, which was, presumably, the point. He held both keys and turned them together, left and right in counterpoint, and the door's bolts retracted one by one, with a sound like a jaw unclenching. The case that held the charter was in the center of the vault, on a stone plinth, lead-lined box, copper fastenings, sealed with wax that bore the original court imprint. 300 years old, never broken, the wax so dark with age, it had gone almost black. Julian broke it. The Charter of Fairness was a single long sheet of treated vellum, written in an ink that had been mixed with silver, so that it would not fade. He was reading it when he heard the door behind him. He had been expecting Anselm. He had not anticipated Anselm and 12 armed temple wardens, and Senator Hayes, with 6 parliamentary soldiers. The kind of coordinated response that suggested the two institutions had been in communication since approximately the moment Julian left the cathedral. The Charter, Anselm said, is a constitutional document and as such falls under the custodial authority of the Joint Parliamentary Ecclesiastical Oversight Committee, which I chair. I'm afraid you've committed a rather serious offense, Clerk Vane. Julian had the charter in his hands. He looked at Anselm. He looked at Hayes. He looked at the soldiers between him and the door. Article 1, he said. Emergency Constitutional Review. The request is filed. The writ is authenticated. And under Article 1, the charter becomes a matter of public record. At the moment the filing is complete. He held it up, which it is. A long silence, the kind with texture. Anselm said, "Take him," but his voice had changed, had lost something, some certainty that had been its foundation. And the soldiers heard it, the way soldiers always hear the difference between an order given by someone who is certain and an order given by someone who is not. They moved. Julian did not run. He raised the charter above his head and said, loudly, clearly, in the carrying voice that 6 years of court work had trained into him, I invoke Article 1 of the Charter of Fairness. I name Valerius of Oakhaven as witness of civic record. I name Senator Hayes and High Priest Anselm as subjects of inquiry. Under emergency constitutional review, these proceedings are now a matter of public record, and any interference with them constitutes contempt of the founding document of this city's law. The vault was stone and lead, and the acoustics were extraordinary. The soldiers stopped. It was not that the words had magic in them. It was that the words had structure, and the soldiers had been trained inside that structure their entire professional lives. And the structure said, "Stop." And there was no one in that vault whose authority was clean enough to tell them otherwise. Anselm and Hayes were still standing there when Julian walked out, the public square of Oakhaven, in the gray pre-dawn light, held somewhere between 300 and 400 people. Julian stood on the steps of the Fair Court building, not the Parliament, not the cathedral, but the court, the neutral ground, with Valerius beside him, and Serafina somewhere in the crowd, and 14 parliamentary members in a loose group to his right, who had the look of people who have waited 11 years to stand somewhere, and are finding it both better and harder than they imagined. He read the charter, all of it, beginning to end, including the sections that had not been read publicly since its ratification, 300 years before. Took 40 minutes. The crowd was silent for the length of it. When he finished, Valerius took the document from him and held it, and his hands were steady. And the expression on his face was the expression of a man holding something that he had been separated from for 11 years, and had wondered, in the worst of those years, whether it still existed. Senator Hayes arrived with soldiers, with the intention of dispersing the proceeding, and found himself standing in a public square, in front of 400 citizens, and 14 members of his own parliamentary body, holding an order of dispersal that was technically invalid under Article 1 of the document that was currently being read aloud by a man whose name was known to every person present. He stood there for a moment. Then he handed his dispersal order to the nearest parliamentary warden, said something quiet, turned, and walked away. High Priest Anselm did not come at all. After, when the crowd had thinned, and the fog had begun the slow retreat it performed every morning, without ever quite completing it, Julian sat on the court steps and breathed. Valerius sat beside him. They were both quiet for a while. "Your father," Valerius said finally. "He kept me alive." "He helped destroy you," Julian said. "Both are true." Valerius was looking out over the thinning fog, toward the city that was beginning to take on the pale color of early morning. He was a man who understood justice, and was afraid of it. That's a more common failure than the ones history remembers. "Is that absolution?" Julian said. "No," Valerius said. "Just accuracy." The sun came up. It was the first time in 11 years that the fog failed to stop it entirely. Whether because of weather, or because of something less explicable, Julian could not have said, and didn't try, came through the eastern gap in the hills, pale and gold and tentative. The kind of light that hasn't decided yet how much to commit. It fell across the square's wet cobblestones, and scattered into small bright shards, and it fell across the charter in Julian's hands, and it fell across Valerius's face, which was turned toward it with the expression of a man receiving something he had decided not to expect. It was not a warm morning. It was cold, and the fog was still there, retreating at the edges. The city was not fixed. The parliament still existed. The cathedral still stood on its hill. There would be proceedings and trials, and the long, grinding machinery of institutional reckoning, which does not move fast, and does not move clean, and does not, in the end, move in a straight line. Julian knew this. He had spent 6 years watching how slowly the law moved. He sat on the steps, with the charter across his knees and the pale sun on his face, and thought, the difference is that now it is moving. The direction is right. The document exists and has been read and cannot be unread, and the witness is alive and cannot be unwitnessed. He did not know if that made him better than his father. He thought it probably made him luckier. In the specific sense of luck, that means, I had not yet accumulated enough to lose. Valerius said, beside him, what happens now? Now, Julian said, we file the paperwork. Valerius looked at him. We are standing in the dawn after 11 years, and the first thing you say is, we file the paperwork. The paperwork, Julian said, is how it becomes real. He stood up, tucking the charter carefully under his arm. Everything that happened today has to be entered in the record. The writ, the authentication, the invocation, the testimony, the charges. If it's not in the record, it didn't happen, officially. And officially is what matters. Come on, he said. I'll explain the filing system. Valerius rose from the steps slowly, with the deliberate care of a man who is not yet sure. All of his joints are in agreement with the project of rising. He looked at the sun, briefly, with the expression of a man who has decided not to make too much of it. He looked at Julian. You are very young to be so pedantic about paperwork, he said. I'm a court clerk, Julian said. It's constitutional. They went inside. Behind them, the fog continued its slow retreat from the square, and the sun continued its tentative advance. And the city of Oakhaven continued its long, complicated business of being a city, imperfect, compromised, full of people trying to figure out which direction to face. In the light now, instead of in spite of it.